Afternoon and welcome to the fourth webinar of the CIPUS Network, Women Writers in History. Today, we will hear more about Bulgarian women writers in the lecture by Professor Nadezhda Alexandrova. Let me first introduce my esteemed colleague, who is also a Bulgarian coordinator of our network. Dr. Nadezhda Alexandrova is an associate professor at the Faculty of Slavic Studies at Sofia University St. Clement Ohridsky in Bulgaria. Her interests are focused on Ottoman and Balkan literature and culture from the 18th and the 19th century, on history of emotions, and on women and gender history. She is the head of the Bulgarian Society for 18th Century Studies, member of the International one, and a board member of the Bulgarian Association of University Women. She is also at the editorial board of Brill publishing series Women Writers in History and a member of the team on the same topic within the European Network for Digital Exchange DARIA. She has published 2 monographs on various entanglements between writing and traveling of people and ideas that happened in the Ottoman space prior to the formation of the separate Balkan nations. She has also published 2 monographs on the woman question in Bulgarian periodicals and on the orientalized image of the Janissaries in the 19th century Ottoman and Bulgarian novels. So, dear Nadia, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Katya, for the kind introduction. Thank you to everyone who managed to join this webinar. I hope there are also colleagues, but also students who can be integrated in our network, because one of the goals of this network is actually to welcome young researchers into this field of women's studies in the Central and Eastern Europe, and of course the transition of those documents that we have and that knowledge that we have onto the digital space. Exactly because of this purpose, today I decided to present to you 3 case studies actually that are connected with women from the region of Central and Eastern Europe, and not so much by their writing, which was predominantly in Bulgarian, but by their movement from different territories where they were born and grew up to the territory of the Ottoman Empire in 2 of the cases, and in the 3rd case from the territory of the Ottoman Empire, the family of Ekaterina Vasilieva moved towards Romania, and then from Romania to Paris, but still keeping her attitude towards Bulgarian national and social questions that made her a Bulgarian writer. So the goal was of choosing this topic was exactly to be able to discuss those kinds of transitions and those kinds of fluid identities that were very often defined by language and also by command of several languages. And that's how I actually got to the question of bilingualism and bilingualism, and also those kinds of imperial identities prior to national identities of subjects of empires, also future citizens of the nations, and those fluid identities that that actually they possessed. But I will, as you have seen from my resume, I will start with a more general description of the context of the 19th century, and will integrate some little bit of women's history, history of women writers into the Ottoman context before presenting to you these 3 case studies. And before the context, Here are also my research questions. And I will just read a little paragraph to make me more confident in the future slides, for which I don't have any written text, so I will speak about the issues further on. So for most of the imperial subjects, bilingualism, a parallel command of two or more languages, was a common thing. So beside the mother tongue, the imperial subjects needed to have skills in dominant languages of trade, church, and administration, which for the Christian subjects of the Ottoman Empire were Greek, the language of trade, Slavonic, in its specific recension as the language of the church, and Turkish, the language of the administration. In this already complex situation, the lecturer wants to add the experience of foreign women who sought opportunity to work as teachers in the Bulgarian community, or in the third case of Ekaterina Vasilieva, a Bulgarian living in Romania, to be part of the intellectual milieu of the Bulgarian diaspora preoccupied with communal work. So I'm interested in the public gestures of declaration of these women in their writing, that they managed to access the local community by becoming proficient in language which is not their mother tongue, and which is not one from the dominant languages of their imperial background. Also, I use some terminology from sociolinguistics, which is not my strength, but still I decided to define the type of bilingualism that these authors use or perform in order to describe the level to which they actually know the language of the local community, the Bulgarian one, and how they manage to sustain their mother tongue, and what are the proofs of the one and the other. And then my major claim is actually how such women who are belonging to, let's say, two cultures, Romanian Bulgarian or Serbian Bulgarian, how actually they are accommodated in the culture in which they write predominantly, or if they are accommodated at all. So that research question is, of course, my critical stance towards the formation of the women's literary canon of the 19th and 20th century. And for these three women, I can tell you, and I can bring some proofs for that claim, that in fact none of those three women writers is known well. None of those women writers is studied. Just one poem from Ekaterina Vasilieva is published in an anthology of the poem of the 19th century. But basically, those women who stay somehow on the margin because they are women writers first, and because they are women writers who are not born Bulgarian, that makes them a weak link in the formation of the national canon, where we know that there are just few women. So these three cannot easily gain any public attention, and that is why I wanted to discuss their lifetime and their publications, so that I do some efforts in that direction of making them more visible, and maybe initiating the first analysis of some of their texts that have remained in the periodicals and have remained in other languages and not in Bulgarian. But before describing their cases and their biographies, I would like to tell to those who don't know much about Bulgarian context of the 19th century some really basic data that I have gathered throughout the years from different sources and that I have put in this slide with basic characteristics of women, Bulgarian women's writing in the Ottoman period. So I've divided those characteristics into 4 streams: education, class, location, and occupation. The general framework for development of the women's activism in the 19th century was provided by the general upheaval in the Ottoman Empire caused by the decision of the sultans of the 19th century, of the governments of the 19th century, to make substantial reforms known as Tanzimat reforms. So within the context of those reforms, known by the name of Tanzimat, different communities in the Ottoman Empire were encouraged to create their own associations, schools, to perform church services into their own mother tongue and not only in Greek. So Bulgarians gradually started such communal work connected with establishing schools, first for boys, and then girls' schools appeared as well. So in terms of education, in order for Bulgarian women to start writing, of course, first the level of literacy had to grow up. As you can see in this first point in the slide, there were 90 primary and 20 secondary schools by the time Bulgaria got liberated in the 1878. And the number of the Women's Association grew to 61, of which it's a very interesting phenomenon that there were 46 associations in the Ottoman territories, but also 7 associations in neighboring countries, in big cities like Bucharest, Braila, Belgrade, Odessa, and other, and some girls' associations affiliated to some schools in the bigger cities. Gradually from the 60s on, women's writing appeared, even before that. So the statistics you can see below at the end of the slide, below these 4 points, is driven from an account. So I haven't counted them myself. I rely on the information provided by one of the most distinguished Bulgarian feminists, historians of women's movement, Krasimira Daskalova. So she counted about 50 women's works, and you can see the statistics, the detailed statistics there in the slide. But who are the women who provided those works, who wrote them and published them in the mostly in periodicals, but also in separate books? Those were, in terms of class, women from the upper classes. We can call them women from the bourgeois class, and so those were women from, even if they were from smaller cities, they belonged to very wealthy families who were able to provide for them really substantial and advanced modern women's education, mostly in big cities. In terms of movement, those young girls becoming then wives of other prominent families, in other prominent families, they entered such families. Those women were their occupation as housewives and sometimes as teachers also, depending on the case, they could engage with writing and translation. Well, there are a lot of interesting case studies that show, first, very interesting cases of mobility between the um, provincial Ottoman territories and small cities in the center of nowadays Bulgaria, women who move and travel to the capital Constantinople, or women who travel to Bucharest or Braila. So there was movement of those women from the 60s, especially 70s, from small cities to big ones and then back. Transportation and postal service allowed such movement to be intensified. So it is a very interesting story of movement between different cities, especially women teachers. They also were persons of such mobility diaspora. They were engaged in different cities as teachers, so they could travel throughout the European Ottoman territories in order to perform this profession. And from those territories, they very often sent contributions to the press that was usually published in Constantinople or in Bucharest, where the big periodicals were published before the Bulgarian independence. So that's some of the that's some of the main characteristics that I just briefly wanted to outline to just make you get an idea of the situation. And if you have questions, perhaps you can ask them after the presentation. If I'm capable to answer them, I'll be very glad. So within this context of women's mobility and occupation, there was a hunger for women teachers because the Bulgarian women's schools were opening very intensively in different places, and there was really a huge lack of teachers who are qualified enough to work in these schools. So Rahil Barak-Dushanova and Joza Iraskova were such foreign women. Rahil was coming from Sremska Mitrovica together with her sister Mileva. And both women, both young girls, graduated the Karlovci Gymnasium and then emigrated to Bulgarian cities. They scattered around different cities as teachers, first in Kyustendil and Sofia, and then Rahil Barak-Dushanova went to Karlovo and Kazanluk, where she found her husband, Dimitar Dushanov. They married and started their journey as a family of teachers in different cities in the area of eastern Romania. That means the south of Bulgaria in the present territorial borders. For Bogdana, the case is a very interesting one as well. She comes from a small Czech town whose name I have to check again. Hradec Karlove. She's born in this city, Hradec Karlove, and when she studied in the high pedagogical school in Prague, she met two Bulgarian women from the small town of Kalofer. They were sisters, Elisaveta and Maria, and they lived together in one apartment. They became very good friends, and when the Bulgarian women invited Joza to become their guest, and when a war was approaching her territories where she lived, she decided, at least that's her official biography, to visit her friends in Bulgaria. And when she visited, she stayed. She met their a relative of theirs Ivan Hitev, and she married him. That's how she stayed in Kalofer, then moved to Karlovo, and then she was migrating between these two cities, commuting between these two cities, which are very close to one another. But after the independence, she also became a teacher in a lot of other cities, again in the southern part of Bulgaria, and she lived really a very long life. As a very prominent teacher and contributor to the women's press. And the third case study, the short biography of Ekaterina Mikhailova Vasileva, is, as you may have seen in the handouts that I sent to Katya, and you can see them in the chat. In the memoir of Ekaterina Mikhailova Vasileva, she writes that she is the second generation immigrant in Romania. Her grandfather emigrated after Russo-Turkish War, and then her mother, who was a Bulgarian, married to a Romanian. So Ekaterina Vasileva was brought up in a mixed family of a Bulgarian mother and a Romanian father, and she knew Bulgarian orally. But as a written language, she was fluent in Romanian and in French, the language of which she was educated in the colleges where she studied in, I think, in Braila. So after that, she married to a very, very wealthy family of Bulgarian merchants who lived in Braila, but were connected with a lot of other Bulgarians who lived in the Romanian territories. And she started being very active in various kinds of activities of the Bulgarian community in Romania. She played roles in the amateur theater performances. She wrote in the local periodicals. She invited people to her house where she had a literary salon. She donated together with her husband big donations for the establishment of a very distinguished Bulgarian scholarly organizations in Braila. Various kinds of activities and also political ones. During the Russian-Turkish War in 1879, she even went to visit the Russian emperor in Crimea, and she gave him portrait made by her, her hands sewn, a portrait that was made by her crafts, I don't know the word, crafting herself in this sewing activities. So she did that very, very beautiful piece of art, I think. She considered it so, and she gave it as a present to the king, to the Russian emperor, and she got a medal for that and some diplomas and some letters, which she kept very dear. And when she became very poor in Paris in the beginning of the 20th century, she sold those medals and those very precious items, objects, to the Bulgarian state, to the Bulgarian government, claiming loyalty to the Bulgarian monarchy and the Bulgarian government, and she received acknowledgement for that, and perhaps also money for that. But she was left almost forgotten in Paris, where she died in the 1923. All alone, I think, and poor, really forgotten by her contemporaries. So the three case studies, as you can see, have some similarities, but the case of Ekaterina Vasileva is a little different from the two other cases. Still, I think it's interesting to combine them when we make an analysis, so that we see different kinds of bilingual proportion. Here in this slide, we see what kind of bilingualism actually those three women perform. As you can see, Rahil Barak's mother tongue is Serbian, Bogdana Hiteva's mother tongue is Czech, and Ekaterina Vasileva knew Bulgarian from her mother. But the interesting situation is the process of learning Bulgarian by Rahil Barak when she migrated to Bulgaria and became a teacher in Bulgarian to the girls at the women's schools in Sofia and in other cities, and also Bogdana, who became a teacher and had to learn Bulgarian really very well. As for Ekaterina Vasileva, she never taught at school, but she was trained very well in those two languages, as I mentioned already. So for her, and in the handout, you see that she confesses that the Bulgarian language is not a strong side. She cannot write very well. She cannot create poems in Bulgarian. She is much more fluent in those two languages that are the languages she grew up and she was educated to. So the type of bilingualism, according to one classification that I used, I can quote Appel and Miesken and also other Kadach, Weinreich, several scholars in sociolinguistics who define different types of bilingualism. So I thought that it is very illustrative to name them coordinate and subordinate, or regressive and progressive. There are two different classifications that I used. So Bulgarian is regressive in relation to French and Romanian for Katerina. All this table is, of course, not just a simple table, but it's a process. It's a process of learning. And before telling you more about this process of learning, I would like also to mention what are the contributions of these women to Bulgarian literature in a very broad sense in this early period. Rahil Barak-Dushanova is known mostly for one translation from Serbian, which is published in Constantinople by Petko Slovejkov in 1869. It's called Presat na Mudrost, and it's a volume consisting of two parts. One is advices of the mothers to the young daughters before marriage, and the second part of this book are anecdotes and wisdom, small lines of anecdotes and wise thoughts by ancient philosophers, by different very prominent kings and queens, exemplary thoughts that also include women, like Madame de Sévigné, Madame de Staël, women's thoughts, popular in such kinds of books of advices that were translated by Rahil Dushanova into Bulgarian from Serbian. The scholars who have studied Rahil Dushanova, who are just few in Bulgaria, Nikolai Aretov is one of them, and perhaps one or two more, suspect that probably she has a lot more of the translations that are attributed to her husband. So in the third point in the slide, you see that There are also 3 more translations from I think again from Serbian, that are signed with a male's name, with the name of Dušanov, her husband. But we think that she took part in those translations, or even they were hers, but they were signed by her husband. And also, I worked with articles in the Bulgarian periodicals, and one excerpt from such an article you can see in the handout, where she claimed her Bulgarian identity, actually. Sorry. So, for me, that second item in the slide, the speech and reportage from the establishment of the Women's Association, is solidifying the argument that gradually, not only Rahil Dušanova was equally fluent in Serbian and in Bulgarian, but she also declared publicly that she already has become Bulgarian, and that she struggles for Bulgarian women's emancipation and Bulgarian betterment, which you can see in the handout in the third example. For Bogdana Iraskova-Hiteva, again, she was very active in the women's movement as a person who established, together with her colleagues and friends, the Bulgarian Women's Associations in Karlovo and Kalofer. She published pedagogical reports, mostly after the Bulgarian independence. And from different sources in the press after the liberation, the first Bulgarian journals like Women's Voice, especially Women's Voice, which was published in the late 80s, late 90s, beginning of 20th century. I have counted 23 articles and 3 theater plays. And it was written that they are translated both from Czech and from German into Bulgarian. Sometimes her name is written, sometimes it's just initials, but that number exists, and it can be further traced, and all these articles should be one after another clearly examined, so that the authorship of this translation is confirmed. What was very interesting for me to know about her is that she published also in the Czech press in the 19th century. Her contribution was kind of a letter or a diary from her experience in the very atrocious revolt of Bulgarians against the Ottomans in the 1876. And in the handout in point 2, you can see my humble translation of part of this text, which was published in Czech language in a Czech journal, which is published in Prague. So you can see that those 2 women, Bogdana and Rahil, they do actually cultural exchange between their cultures of birth, Serbian and Czech, and Bulgarian one. They are contributing with their skills and efforts as teachers, but they are also exchanging information or translating from Czech, from Serbian, and to the Czech community of people interested in the Bulgarian news. Bogdana also contributed to the Czech press. And for Ekaterina Mikhailova-Vasileva, we see a number of articles in the Bulgarian press in Romania, also in Bulgarian press in Constantinople, the journal Turcia, and a lot of 5 or 6 poems written in Romanian in Bulgarian newspapers. Some of those poems are translated in like in a prose, not in a poetical rhythmical translation, but just in terms of contents. Others are left just like this. In her writing experience, she has clearly shown that she is eager to write poetry about Bulgarian events and heroes, but in the languages that she's fluent. So the last of her writings, the piece called Anal de la Dynastie Russe, she wrote it in Paris, where she emigrated, as I said, towards the end of the 19th century, and where finally she died. So for me, an interesting aspect of the analysis of these three cases is that it was not a very easy task for these three women to be integrated into the very traditional and sometimes very hostile Bulgarian society of the 19th century Ottoman provincial cities. In the memoirs and some other biographical data by the biographers of Bogdana and Rahil, we know that when they first became teachers, Rahil in Sofia and Bogdana in Kalofer, to them there was a very hostile attitude. They were accused of not knowing Bulgarian, that they are not eligible to continue being teachers in these cities, that they are very self-confident, and also that they teach subjects that are probably improper. This is especially valid for Bogdana, who introduced the modern type of sewing, this Brussels kind of crafting, into the Bulgarian Kalofer community of women. And for her skills, she was very welcomed by the women. They created a small, let's say, domestic school to develop this craft, which was very fashionable, very interesting for the Bulgarian women of the time. But the local community, especially the priests and the upper class males, they were accusing her of teaching the girls some improper activities. At one point, that exactly because of such accusations, she was expelled from Karlovo. She moved to Kalofer, then she returned back. She was really commuting between those two cities, but some of the accusations were exactly because of the new practices that she wanted to introduce in the local community. So for both of them, it was a struggle to integrate. And in this struggle, there were people who helped. There were the husbands, there were the local friends who made this process easier. For Ekaterina Vasilieva, as you already perhaps saw in the handout, she confesses her inability to write in Bulgarian and her desire to learn how to write in beautiful Bulgarian, in Bulgarian calligraphy, българско краснописание, she says. In her case, it is very difficult to discuss the authorship, because most of her articles in the Bulgarian press are actually translated by the editor, whose words you can see in italic in the handout. She is encouraging Ekaterina Vasilieva and says that he's encouraging Ekaterina Vasilieva and says that he even didn't edit much, but still his role in promoting her works was great. So it is again some kind of a ventriloquism to perform a woman's voice from the male's editorial one. That makes the case difficult to analyze. That's why I think we should analyze deeper, not so much those translations in Bulgarian periodicals, but the text that remained in the languages that she knew fluently, namely Romanian and French. Also, my initial claim that once they claim they have become Bulgarians, they insist on their Bulgarian identity more than anything else. They have been gradually accepted until, I mean, since they, some of them lived longer, they in fact had longer time to claim that. So for Rahil Dushanova, that is very visible, as I already said in her speech. She says, we, the Bulgarian women, we have a tradition of Orthodox Christianity. Bogdana Hiteva actually converted to Orthodox Christianity as well when she married and changed her name from Josefa to Bogdana. And Katerina Vasilyeva is also declaring her love to her fatherland in all the texts she wrote, and they are printed and we know them. So for the three cases, in fact, insisting on the Bulgarian identity despite the foreign origin, let's say, is a very interesting and similar characteristics. That I think was a strategic effort of those women to remain somehow within the frames of the Bulgarian intelligentsia of the time, and perhaps also to remain remembered after their death. But what happened is that in fact, exactly their marginal place, I think, hampered their remembrance. So on the one hand, their bilingualism helped them to find a job, to have access after becoming fluent to printed press, to do cultural diplomacy, to do translation, which is also published, which was rare of the time. But on the other hand, in some of the cases, their voice was, as I said, perhaps put into the shade, or how can I explain that? Their voice was diminished in its power after their death. For the case of Rahil Dushanova, it's very clear. She died in the 80s. She was very sick, very weak, and in 1888 she died. So it was her husband, Dimitar Dushanov, who wrote biographies about her. He was the first to write biographies of his wife, and their autobiography together, a memoir of their life together. So my suspicion is that he was able to restructure a lot of biographical data from her early years in Serbia. He doesn't say almost anything about her origin, her family, her maybe another religion from Sremska Mitrovica, and he just describes her decision to come to Bulgaria together with her mother and her sister Mileva. So in this effort for the husband to restructure, reframe, and actually influence and manipulate the biography of his wife, I see an effort, in fact, to diminish that voice, to make this voice less powerful and more prominent in its let's say Bulgarian tones. What I mean is exactly that in her biography, only the devotion to the Bulgarian national idea is left, and all the other specific features are somehow driven out. And that kind of manipulation with the biography, I see as a factor for the marginal status of Rahil Dushanova in the national history of literature and culture. In a similar, but of course different situation is Ekaterina Vasilieva. In her memoir, those of you who have seen the pages that I sent, that I have from this rare book, they can see that she has a deep respect for monarchy. And especially during the period of socialism, her voice was not very proper. This book was not analyzed until today. It was not translated. It is not translated. Her life is not investigated in any deeper way, and she is just quoted exactly by the same texts that promote her as a Bulgarian, possessing a Bulgarian identity. So the only way those women could enter any discussion about Bulgarian history of literature is through their Bulgarian identity, and all the rest is actually left out. And I come to the end of my presentation by these final words that I would like to tell as a conclusion, that the peripheral place of these women can be overcome by their inclusion in projects such as this one, where the Romanian colleagues, for example, can help searching the traces in the local newspapers, and the Czech colleagues can do something similar for the Czech Bulgarian case. So in such a network as CIPUS, we hope that in communities of researchers, we can enhance the process of investigation of these marginal cases, and also, of course, translate and digitalize their works so that the contemporary readers can know them better. And that's, in fact, the end of my presentation.
Thank you very much, Nadia, for this rich presentation in which we learn so much new about Bulgarian cultural history, but also about all these interesting women writers. And I think that you have shown very clearly how important it is to explore different identities of women writers who belong to more than just one literature or culture. And of course, nation, especially in the 19th century. And women writers often also acted as cultural mediators. We know so much about women writers who lived in other cultures, but here it seems that they did not so much, they could not really transmit their first language, their first culture into this new environment. So perhaps this would be my question, and then I give immediately a word to other colleagues, because I know that they all also have many questions, I suppose. So thank you very much once again.
Thank you, Katya. If this was a question also about the way they transmitted their original culture, I think they tried to do that by translation from those languages, from Serbian and from Czech and from German, in fact. And that was the most they could do, I guess. So that's my short answer.
Thank you. So please, if you have a question, just say it. just put it to Nadezhda.
Sorry, I was trying to unmute myself. Yes, thank you, Nadia. It's been a treat, especially because, as you suggested, there are so many opportunities arising from such research. And actually, I don't know if you remember my the intimacy workshop that we hosted with the Gothenburg University. I mean, it was online. Was exactly my key speech was exactly on this, the same problematic that obviously stirs a lot of interest, and has it's very fertile. Yes, it's extremely fertile territory. And I suggested then the concept of in-betweenness, isn't it? Yes, I mean, this is what this is, an in-betweenness of identity, and identity formation. And thinking of what, listening to what you were saying, I was thinking of such extreme instances of Romanian women writers who are either Romanian, purely Romanian, ethnically speaking, or not. Yes, but they are in between languages. They are, especially because, upper strata, they were supposed to be educated in French and other languages, but mostly French, and their language of expression would be French, therefore. And speaking of the canon, yeah, this was the part that especially stirred my interest, because, and this could be also a question for you, what happened with the Romanian canon is that certain writers were actually programmatically rejected from the canon by male critics, stating strictly, stating that, specifically stating that they can't be integrated in the literary canon because they didn't write in Romanian. Not contesting their Romanianness, so to say, because they would write about the Romanian identity, and they would fight for the Romanian cause and so on, national liberation and so on. But they would do so in French because that was the language of the intellectuals. Yes. And still they were rejected for this reason, for being traitors. And of course, the context would be that of, the Marxism and socialism, but there was no socialism, totalitarianism, which took over, unfortunately, took over this with that horrible political correctness. So I'm really saluting your initiative, and actually it's much more. It's less. I'm happy that it gives me an incentive to be less theoretical and more practical, and I'm willing to take the challenge and work together if should you start something, a project, a concrete project. So this idea of unearthing the contribution, clearly and practically unearthing the contribution of these women and making them so much more visible. And the digital humanities tool is obviously at hand. Yes, this is, I'm really excited, actually. And so to end with my comment, there is also the question, did you have you noticed, have you found in the mainstream critical approaches, yeah, or literary critics, any direct a rejection of these women because they didn't write in Bulgarian? Was it directly outspokenly mentioned by the literary critics?
Mhm. Well, for your comment and the question, my answer would be that I'll speak about process. So for the in-betweenness concept, I'm also very familiar with Homi Bhabha's concept of in-betweenness in the post-colonial criticism, and that's a very nice and sexy concept, and I like it.
But
But for the cases, for the cases that I investigated, I mostly see that there was a process of becoming or a desire to become integrated so strong that along the way the first language has to be given up and no, local one to be embraced, at least when these women were alive and they would craft their public appearance. And then again, after their death, in between this becomes uh, vivid again and active in criticism. Although in Bulgaria, in the Bulgarian case, we don't have harsh criticism to those young, earlier writers. Maybe because the literature of 19th century is so much influenced by nationalistic grand narratives, so that women's identity is very often infused within the national upheaval, and so the critics would encourage any women's performance when it is related somehow to some national idea. My simple answer for one of the cases, for the Bulgarian in Romania, Ekaterina Vasileva, is that until recently she was not included in the anthology of Bulgarian poets from the 19th century. And just in the second edition of this anthology, one of her verses was included. And it was done exactly because her verses were actually written in another language and not translated by herself in print when they appeared in the periodical. But what I think more and more is that it really depends on the timing of certain meta text criticism, because recently such old authors like Nabokov, like Julia Kristeva, like so many others, have been investigated exactly in their transnational, global, let's say, marginal, but also migrant identity, which has become actually their label when they traveled and stayed in another country, like in France or in the States. I think that it's a question also of method.
but
That exactly today it's very good to create such an analytical
framework.
perspective.
Yeah, yeah. Now, hearing what you were saying about Nabokov and the like, I was thinking that there are obviously beginning of 20th century in between the two wars period intellectuals, Romanian intellectuals who continued to be bilingual, and some of them chose to work do their work in French because they moved to France and they became Romanian French intellectuals and such and so on. But most of these were men, and that didn't seem to be a problem with integrating them in the literary canon whatsoever, because of their choice of, like Ciorani, Ionesco, and so on. It seems only to be a problem with women. Yeah,
That's why it's a double
at least in the Romanian
marginalization.
canon, it has been a problem with women that they didn't write in, or if they did write in Romanian, they weren't valuable enough to enter the canon. So the only recent example that I can think of, who you were talking about, Kristeva, right? The only recent example that stirred again a discussion which should have been for decades or even a century now, was with Herta Müller when she was awarded the Nobel Prize for Literature. All of a sudden, everybody heard of Herta Müller, and we were, discussing in every corner, like when you discuss football. What is she? Is she Romanian? Is she German? She was born here and then she left there. She's a traitor, and I mean, it was really very an awakening moment for the
Yeah.
Romanian society. But then it went flat again. So then we went back to our our usual canon from the 19th century. I mean, it's fantastic. It's just so again, I really salute your
Thank you very much.
initiative. It's really something that I want to join. Thank you.
Okay.
Yes,
Thanks very
please.
much.
Can I also congratulate Nadezhda for this really very interesting talk. I was listening with in mind, obviously, Isabelle de Chaillère, who I'm now working on, and who is between languages also, of course, and for whom, with our Swiss colleague, Valérie Cossy, we are often discussing, well, she's too much in between, so she is not in our collective memory, she is not in the canon, etc. So I will try comparing and seeing in how far comparing to your cases is interesting. But what I'm really curious to see how this will work out. Chaillère is much more critical toward the Netherlands. She remained in contact, and well, there's all this correspondence we're working on now. And there we can clearly see how she's criticizing her own country. So, and the mentality and people and attitudes and so on. But she also sees quite some positive aspects, of course. So in that sense, it might be different from the three women you have been discussing now. And so I would be curious to see more of these similar cases and try comparing at some point. I really think this is an interesting perspective to try adopting for a group like ours, indeed. Yeah. So thank
Thanks
you
very much. Thank you, Susan. What I think now is that since you said that you are investigating mostly the letters,
Yeah.
and the letters are usually these layers of private correspondence, although sometimes they also became public and printed. So the key word here is exactly letters. If we are able to find private correspondence of these women, I'm sure there will be much more reluctance and discouragement and various feelings, intimacies of various kinds. But in the public presence, and that is valid not only for them but for many other women who tried to appear publicly in the 19th century, somehow they felt self-censored. They felt this drive to speak about the community, that it's improper to speak about critically about the community, and they did it only if they had to criticize their fellow women. So they sometimes criticized women who were more consumerist, more objective, wrote or read popular culture, popular novels. In that sense, they could be critical, but to the fellow sisters, let's say, and not to the Bulgarian community as a whole. That's a taboo topic.
Well,
but
concerning Chaillère and the Swiss context, she is completely integrated because having been taught French right from early youth. So there is no criticism there. And indeed, as Carmen was saying, the situation for French as one of those international languages is probably different, I imagine.
Yeah.
I really look forward to trying to compare on a kind of a larger scale. Yes. Thank you very much.
That would be great. A new project is born.
Yeah. And still, if I can make just one more comment, sorry, and then I have to rush off and pick up my boys from kindergarten. I'm really glad I was able to listen to all your presentation. But still, there are women writers like Susan has mentioned. For instance, in my presentation, I had Ana Denoy. She did reject her Romanian identity with her whole being. You know, she was Romanian born through her father. She was born in Romania, and through her father, she was Romanian. And she did reject her Romanian identity. She didn't want to have anything to do with it. What do we do with these women? Do we just reject them because they didn't have this process, or they were in between, or they didn't go through this process of becoming Bulgarian, Romanian, or what do we do with them? You know, is this the only criterion that makes us fight for them to integrate them in the canon if they want to become to acquire the national identity?
I think that here we can speak about visibility and not integration. It's the first step is to make them visible, and then
Right.
After a research is done, critics would decide, or the future will decide about their final integration or not, or they themselves can decide. But what I think is valid, especially in these very turbulent years when new nationalistic societies and trends are entering our national space, and both in Poland, as I know, and in my country, and in many others, in Hungary, and perhaps also in Romania, you can see this. Really harsh neo-nationalistic trends that actually diminish the efforts of our research, and that's why I think that we should encourage every next gesture of making somebody visible, because that nationalistic drive or trend in the contemporary culture may leave out the women we try to integrate the moment we integrate them. So it's a very dynamic process, and especially with women from minorities, as Justina works on their biographies and writing. That's even a more cherished and difficult exercise, to be able to find those women, to make them visible, and to make precautions for those women to not to fall out of the neo-rigidifying canon. Because I think that's the frightful future, that no matter what we do, in fact, the women who are in the canon remain there, and the women we try to make visible, we will fail in doing that. And perhaps even exactly digitalization and traces onto the digital space can help us with this.
Absolutely, yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Right. Thank you. I'm sorry, I have to rush.
Yeah, it's 10 past 5.
Okay.
But I think that we still have time. We still have time for another question, perhaps the last one. So, Lucina, hello. Nice to see you again.
First of all, I would like to say hello to all of you. Thank you, Magdalena Koch, for giving me a link to this meeting, and I'm really happy to see you all.
You're welcome.
Okay, but not to be only emotional. And speaking about neo-nationalism. When I was listening to you, Nadezhda, I was asking myself, what was tempting, what was attractive in Bulgarian language and in Bulgarian culture and national identity that made those three women so strongly connected to this notion. And as they were speaking in name of Bulgarian woman. So was it only love and deep connection to their man, or was there something intellectually attractive in Bulgarian nationalism for them that they could not find anywhere else? As I think it's love may be accidental, but decision to marry and to learn to teach something in not in my mother language is a decision of a big effort. And so it's not easy for me to accept only decision of a soul or a love, or it had to be something else. But what was it?
Certainly, Uchina, very, very great question that you ask, very thought-provoking. Certainly, love was a drive, and finding a husband in Bulgaria made them stay and become fluent also in Bulgarian and bring up children in this society. But what I think is that what initially made them travel and challenged them to come to the Ottoman Empire was their sense of agency and activism, and their desire to find a job opportunity. Because at that moment, in Bulgarian schools and territories, there was really a great lack of capable teachers, instructors in different subjects. In a lot of Bulgarian schools, male teachers were teaching both in male schools and the women's section of the school. So women trained abroad, if Bulgarian women trained abroad were encouraged to come back, become teachers, they used fellowships for that. And also a similar trend was to invite teachers from the region of Eastern and Central Europe to become teachers in Bulgarian cities. In fact, after the liberation, after 1878, a lot of Czech male teachers were coming, especially to the Danubian cities, and they were becoming teachers in different subjects, also fancy subjects like gymnastics, introduced for the first time. So it was a general trend of finding occupation in a place where there is demand. But for those women as well, of course, they had an income. They had an income and they could perform their job. They could travel. And I think that's a very, very serious reason for migrating. And also, in the biographies that I know of, especially for the Bogdana's case, she knew Bulgarians from before. She has met Bulgarians where she studied back in Prague, and she knew and probably liked their attitude, or I don't know. She developed a kind of friendship and good attitude before coming to the country. And also one very interesting aspect that I haven't researched very well, especially for Bogdana Hiteva, is that during the very turbulent times of the April Revolt of 1876, when she tried to escape with her children, she went to Plovdiv, and she was very much helped and hidden by the Bashibuzuks, by the Protestant missionaries there. So, and also by the local foreigners in the big cities. So I assume that there was a connection between other foreigners and her that we don't know of, and that she was not so much alone in her being the only Czech in the city, but she was communicating with the Germans, with other Austro-Hungarian subjects who had Austro-Hungarian passports, with the Protestant missionaries. They were usually Americans who were spread around the Ottoman territories and who knew lots of languages as well. So there was a network that we don't know much of. And that's a very interesting network to investigate. Perhaps letters can help us and biographies, but I'm not so sure if we can do that again by ourselves. Perhaps there are letters in some Protestant archives about the same period, or other kinds of sources that has to be investigated, perhaps the documents of the diplomats. And we can see that these women were not alone, not so alone of their foreign identity in the Bulgarian cities, but they had friends and other foreigners to talk to. Thank you very much.
Okay, so thank you very much again, Nadezhda, and thank you also, Carmen, Susan, and Lucina, for your questions, which enabled further discussion, and we will learn so much more about these interesting topics, which we will explore, I'm sure, also in the next webinars. And before saying goodbye, let me invite you to our next webinar, which will take place on 26th of March, so save the date, please. And Professor Biljana Dojinovic, Professor Masha Grdeshic, and I will present the volume, Defined Trajectories, Mapping Out Slavic Women Writers' Roots, which we edited in the framework of the project Women Writers' Root. And we will also present this project. And please note, we will start later than today at 6 p.m. So let's meet then, and thank you very much for your attention. I wish you a pleasant evening and a wonderful weekend. Bye-bye.
Thank you, Katya. Thank you,
Thank you very
everyone.
much.
It was a pleasure.
Fascinating. Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye. Bye. Thank you.
Bye-bye.